Welcome to Medicine Grand Rounds. It's a pleasure for me to introduce one of our division heads to you today, Dr. Eric Poeschla. Dr. Poeschla is a Tom Gill Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases, and he heads up the Division of Infectious Diseases. Dr. Poeschla received his bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College, then went on to receive an MD degree from Yale University. He received house staff training at UC San Francisco, UCSF, and fellowship training at UC San Diego. He then spent the first part of his career where he established himself in virology at Mayo Clinic. And then we were fortunate to recruit him here in 2014 as the division chief. And he's done a superb job as our division chief of infectious diseases. Dr. Poeschla is a world authority on RNA viruses, specifically HIV and just recently SARS-CoV-2. He's specifically interested in the molecular mechanisms involved in viral integration into the human genome, and has taken a very strong interest over the past year in SARS-CoV-2 and the variants related to SARS-CoV-2. It's a pleasure to introduce him to you today because I know that he's going to have some very insightful comments about the variants of SARS-CoV-2 and the potential emerging problems that may occur as a result of these variants. So Eric, let me just say, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll have a discussion at the end of Dr. Poeschla's formal comments.
Thanks very much, David. Title of my talk is Emerging SARS-CoV-2 Variants, Implications for the Pandemic, the Vaccines, and Our Patients. And in this talk, I'm divided into three main sections. First is the rise of the variants and what they are. I'll talk about geographies, timelines, and properties, and then delve a bit into the implications for our epidemic here. Will there be a fourth COVID wave? Immunity, vaccines, and treatment. If we have time, perhaps at the end or perhaps in the question session, talk about what the future might bring if there are limits to all of this, to variant evolution. So this cartoon here is showing, I imagine, a Denver healthcare worker standing there on the edge of the high plains in December. Rockies in the background. And he's pretty sure he's got this virus taken care of with what could be a syringe of a monoclonal antibody or a vaccine, most likely when he feels a tap on his back, and there's a variant. So a point of reflection. Today is really about 1 year exactly before things really hit. The massive shutdown started across the country. Time to take stock. Much has been lost. Life has changed in profound ways. I look back on March 10th, 2020, there were only about 140 cases in New York identified and a handful of deaths in the whole country. This is the New York Times on Sunday, February 21st, where a dot, each dot represents a death. And as it got towards January, it's pretty saturated. 500,000 US dead, 2.6 million globally. These are some of the things we thought we'd never see. Field hospitals in Central Park, saying goodbye to loved ones via electronic devices. This is a picture, I think, in Colombia of a nurse holding a phone so parents could say goodbye to their neonate who was dying. They weren't allowed in. More recently, mass deaths and oxygen shortages in Brazil. I'll touch on that because it touches on it later on and touches on the B1351 variant. All right, so where are we now? This is a sort of status update, March 10th, 2021. The good thing is that, as you know, numbers have been falling steadily. The US is administering about 2 million vaccine doses per day. About 10% of us are fully vaccinated, about 18% have had one dose. On the flip side, 90% aren't fully vaccinated. But the concerning part is that cases are now plateauing at high levels. If you look over here on the left, these are daily cases in the US. We're really gotten down to where the peak was in July. In Colorado, we plateaued as well with cases, even at a time of less testing, actually. And we're above where we were. Hospitalizations between the peak in July and March and the nadir, pretty much about the same thing. We're now where the peak we were in July in Colorado. Progress has slowed. New York and Miami have persistently high case numbers, multiple governors, politicians insisting on using restrictions. Not unusual to have 2,000 deaths a day now. And we're seeing exponential expansion of this 40 to 70% more transmissible B.1.1.7 variant. It was about 4% of US cases a month ago, paralleling what happened in the UK and other countries, now about 22% rising up to 35 to 40% in some areas. I'll go into that. CDPHE now estimates about 3 to 6% of Colorado cases are B.1.1.7 as of March 5th, and also 3 cases of the South African variant were reported in Colorado on March 5 of the South African B.1.351 variant. And when B.1.1.7 hit 50% in Europe, there were major surges. So what follows is really a story of evolution. This is where we were a year ago. This is where we are now. This virus recently crossed the species barrier certainly from bats, perhaps to an intermediate mammal, to us. It's now replicated through hundreds of millions of people, 120 million confirmed, but probably many more. And a good thing to realize is that half of that has been since December. This is about December 1st. And so 50% of that has really been very recent. So it's still replicating massively. It's still exploring sequence space that it can explore in its new host. And now immune pressure is really coming into play as a major selective force. Natural immunity, vaccines, and to a lesser extent, therapeutic antibodies. As I go through this, of course, the main focus will be on the surface spike glycoprotein, and all the mutations I'll talk about are in spike, but the variants have mutations in other proteins too. This is a diagram of the virus. This is an electron micrograph. This is the spike protein. Here it is, a structural modeling of the trimer. It's 3 of them. It's trimeric. This is a particularly important mutation that I'll talk about, E484K. Here's N501Y. You can see they're right up against the human ACE2 receptor. So it's at the tip of the spear of the virus that people are most concerned about where these mutations are occurring, right where it engages the ACE2 receptor. And for those of you who aren't used to talking about amino acid mutations, the shorthand is when we say N501Y, we mean that an asparagine or an N has changed to a tyrosine residue or a Y at amino acid 501. And so for E484K means a glutamic acid, or E has changed to lysine, K at position 484. And the nomenclature is difficult, it's arcane, it's evolving, and it's really not solved yet. Much discussion about it, but even the taxonomists can't seem to solve this. And it's really an unprecedented problem because we've never really had these many viral strains or any microorganisms to name. There are now 700,000 sequences, at least, of SARS-CoV-2, full genome sequences. But these are the main players. I'll talk briefly about D614G, which is spread around the world, and mostly about these 3, B.1.1.7, B.1.351, P1, a tiny bit on what are called the US variants, but this is where we'll focus. And the issue of naming by geography has come up. It's recognized that these can be stigmatizing and shouldn't be done in the long term, but we do use these. And I found giving talks that constantly saying these things only is confusing and disorienting and a little bit eye-glazing to people, and that the place names help to orient people, say where they're from, help them remember. So I will use country names. And also, it's not really stigmatizing. It's actually to their credit, because it's these countries that the scientists that really did the work to identify these. We didn't, because our sequencing is so bad in this country that we haven't picked up variants until recently. But it's really, the UK has the most amazing sequencing operation. South Africa actually first identified N501Y. So it's really actually testimony to these science to call these, and they're rather proud of what they've done. So I will call them the UK variant, the South African variant, and the Brazil variant. And so names like this are actually helpful in a sense that they produce unambiguous text strings. So if you search Google or PubMed or whatever with B1351 with a period in between, you get nothing else. There's suggestions that we just call them V1, V2, and V3. That's still going on. The problem is that this pangolin nomenclature kind of runs out when you get to the next step. So P1 is also B11281, which is kind of where I hit the wall in remembering them. So that's now called P1. All right, let's look at the big picture. This is a diagram that was actually put together by a journalist at The Economist. And I overlaid some things on it, but the blue part is his, James Grantham. And it shows the phylogenetic tree through time. And it tracks two particular important mutations that I've already mentioned with these red and blue boxes. And the first point to make is there are many variants. We're going to talk about mainly 3 today, but there are actually many. There are actually hundreds of thousands of sequences and strains in the databases. So where it starts is D614G, an aspartate to glycine at position 614 spike. It arose early, became ubiquitous by May. There's really not that much to say about it because it's everywhere. And then from that, B1, everything else descends. So there are 3 main variants of concern, and these came to attention in December, although look back show them appearing as far back as August in certain sequence databases. The first attention was on B117 in the UK, then B1351 in South Africa, and then P1 in Brazil. The third point is that convergent evolution is happening, especially with this residue, E484K. If you remember one amino acid change going forward, when you read popular accounts, when you read papers, remember E484K, a shift of a glutamic acid to a lysine. It shifts from a negative to a positive charge, alkaline to basic. And so it's a kind of a big deal in protein structure, and it seems to be important. And so these are flagged through here. And then not only are there human variants, and then there's the California and New York variants that just sort of got mentioned, but their importance is not clear. Final point is that this virus is remarkably able to infect a lot of mammals, in particular carnivores, but also non-human primates. It hasn't cycled back to bats as far as we know yet. You can even make it replicate in mice if you adapt it. And over 17 million mink had to be culled in Denmark, at least 1 million in Holland. It's probably the end of the mink fur farming business. But the possibility that you could have zoonotic cycling, the virus could actually go back or in parallel replicate in those species has not been discounted. And in fact, that's why Denmark killed all those mink and really ended their industry. It's not clear that this is a big deal. There's been, but it was probably wise to not let parallel evolution and swapping back and forth happen. Okay, now if I just take all that away and focus on that mutation, that glutamic acid to lysine mutation, you can see that first was identified in South Africa, but it's also in New York and California. It's in Denmark. It's in Brazil, and they came up independently. And that's the signature of selection, an advantage to the virus, a selective advantage. It's not a chance effect. It didn't sequentially spread or either contiguously or by air travel or whatever from South Africa to the world. It came up in different places, and that's convergent evolution. Bats and bird wings arose completely independently. This is a mammal, this is a bird, but they arrived at the same solution. Okay. And just as an aside, COVID has produced a historical first. Amino acid mutations have achieved popular fame, and even nicknames. And so N501Y is kind of what you called Nelly, and E484K Eric or Eek. There's a Karen, or K17N because there's always a Karen, and a whole bunch of others. And it's led to memorable phrases like from Christian Andersen, Nelly, she's trouble, but the real problems start when she starts to hang out with bad boy Eric. Okay. Now, in thinking about these mutations, and this is about as molecular as we're going to get here, but they can really do two things, and not mutually exclusive. They can do two things at once. They can co-selected. They can enhance entry, and by optimizing interaction, this is Spike coming up against the human ACE2 receptor, and you see that E484 is right there at the interaction, and it probably increases affinity, but can also do something else. Neutralizing antibodies bind to Spike, and if you create a mutation that enhances binding here but resists previous neutralizing antibodies, you can get this situation. And then that makes it now free to bind to the ACE2 receptor. So two things going on at once, two main selective forces. There's probably others. If you try to make SARS-CoV-2 escape in the lab, you can readily make it do so. And this is an elegant experiment done by Paul Benash and Theodore Hatziano at Rockefeller, where they passaged a pseudovirus expressing Spike multiple times. And just in 2 to 3 passages, a couple of days in the lab, there were E484K was selected, and it's actually the first time this was really flagged to attention. So here's each green dot here is an infected focus, because it expresses GFP, and then after 3 passages, this might even be 2, I forget, you see foci of resistant virus coming up, and this is one of the mutations. This is the main mutation that came up. If you then do the other experiment where you look at existing sera, this is a paper from Jesse Bloom's lab in Seattle, in cells to microbe. You can see that in some subjects, you get a marked shift to the right. It takes much more antibody to inhibit infectivity, whereas in others, there's no effect. So it's reduced in some sera, did not ablate it. And this does not equal reduced clinical immunity. So there's a lot of papers out there, tests and people looking in the lab at sera, but that doesn't mean that people are not going to be immune. It's just one kind of immunity. And this is the basic situation. We're now on March 10th, looking at the big picture. We've got a wave of vaccination coming. Colorado's at about 18%, 10% fully vaccinated. We've got ancillary to that, we've got non-pharmaceutical interventions, mask and distancing, which we know about well. And on the other side, we have the variants coming, unsafe behavior, what governors like to call opening. And we have this plateauing situation where 3 to 6% are B117. There's no real reason to think that it won't behave like it did in the UK. Now I'm going to go into the individual variants. It really spans 4 continents. 614G around the world, B117 from the UK, B1351, South Africa, P1 Brazil, and then these American variants briefly. This is an image that I liked from the Washington Post this week about, it's an article about how scientists underestimated this, even the experts early on, but it shows the virus taking over the world. All right, D614G, this was the first variant. It very rapidly spread. It's now ubiquitous, D to G at 614 in Spike. You can see it rapidly first came up around February. By May, it's complete replacement around the world. And I've highlighted that date with this date. This paper just came out last week in Nature. It took a whole year for the reviewers from Nature to sign off on this paper, but it's a nice paper from a German, Swiss, and CDC collaboration, very large group where they did a bunch of things. They did in vitro assays showing that spike has increased binding to the human receptor. It has increased replication in primary human airway cultures, and in vivo, markedly increased replication and transmission if you knock in human ACE2 in a mouse and in hamsters and ferrets. And this just shows you that to show increased transmission and prove it is not simple. It can be a combination of epidemiologic and animal and other evidence. All right, let's talk about B117, and I'll talk most about this. This is the UK variant. It was first flagged in December in 2020 from viral genome data and the realization that infections in Kent, in the southeast corner of the country, were not falling despite restrictions. This map is actually old. There'll be more about on this. It's now greater than 80 countries that have it. Appears to be more transmissible, about 40 to 70% so. There are 23 amino acid changes actually in the whole virus. The main change is N501Y and not E484K or K417NR2 like in the other variants. In spike of those 23, there are 8 total. And there's a deletion that's important because that can be picked up in diagnostic PCR tests, including a lot of them that we do here at UCH, and that's called a spike gene target failure, or S gene dropout, where that deletion means the probe doesn't bind and you can actually just pick it up in the diagnostic assay, not by next-gen sequencing. No real evidence yet for escape from natural vaccine immunity with this one. There is recently a suggestion. When I gave a town hall in January, I said no about this, but then recent preprints and reports, 2 of them, one from UK and one from Denmark, suggesting more severe disease. That's been hard to prove. A lot of confounders. They're reporting an odds ratio of about 1.65 for hospitalization or death. And they're assessing it as a realistic possibility of higher mortality. I would regard that as preliminary at this point, but it's something to keep in mind that B117 could also be more severe in a given patient. All right, I just want to show you movies things. So this is a protein model rotating of a trimer or spike. It is a trimer, and so that's why this is N501Y, and you can see there are 3 of them, but the trimer that engages folds up, and you can see N501 right up against the ACE2 receptor. If I add in all the other mutations, they're there too. This is the actual South African variant where there are actually 2 mutations up there. And then just want to show a map of B117, what happened in England. This is a map showing replacement of B117. This is a percent or fraction. So deep indigo means 100% replacement. And it goes from November 10th to December 29th, so 49 days. And it started in Kent, this is London, here, and it spread over 49 days to essentially almost full replacement. Right now, I think this map would be complete blue. And so this was very fast. And this was in the setting of other variants being there. It was in the setting of fairly, a lot of sort of super spreading type events, but it really took over and it's full replacement. Okay. So as I said, it very rapidly replaced other viruses in the UK. And there were 2 possibilities that people entertain. One is a founder effect that it just took over by chance, like we had in the US. There were super spreading events in the UK too. This is December 5th, young people outside Harrods in London protesting the closing of nightclubs and things. And a lot of people thought this was a founder effect, which means it took over by chance. And a founder effect is really like if these 4 people get shipwrecked on this island in the South Pacific, and 3 of them are redheads, and they start mating with each other, you're pretty soon going to have a lot of redheaded kids. That doesn't mean that the redheaded genes are better or more fit, or these people descendants are more fit. In fact, they might even be less fit because they're out there in the South Pacific and they're more prone to get melanoma. And it might be this guy's descendants that really are more fit in the long term, but you're going to see opportunistically, you're going to see red-haired offspring. The possibility two, which most people now believe, it could be both, but is that it's intrinsically more transmissible and spreads more easily from person to person. A lot of evidence for that, but really the smoking gun, I think, was this beautiful study, almost 1 million people in the UK, called the Test and Trace program, where they did actual contact tracing. And they compared B1117 infected people with wild type infected people. And they found, and this is almost 1 million people, and they found that secondary contacts, 15% of the B1117 people got infected and 11% of the wild type, estimated 35 to 50% higher attack rate, more infectious, consistent across all age groups and regions. You might say, well, okay, 15 versus 11, but you know, what's the big deal? But it is a big deal. This is modeling done by Adam Kucharski at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. And it shows quite nicely that if you ask theoretically, intuitively, you think a more lethal virus would be worse. So if you pose it as what would we rather have, a 50% more lethal SARS-CoV-2 or a 50% more transmissible one? And any one patient, of course, would rather have a more transmissible one, but on a population level, we definitely want a more lethal one. It sounds counterintuitive, but you get many more deaths because of the exponential effect of greater transmissibility versus the arithmetic effect of lethality in any one person. Another thing that's become apparent, and is kind of a main idea now, is that B117 and perhaps other variants might have arisen not by extended replication in one or a few immunocompromised people. This isn't B11, but there's a very well documented case at Mass General, Brigham, MIT, Harvard, and the NEJM in December. And this was a highly immunocompromised patient. He had antiphospholipid syndrome. He really had no immunity, or very little, and all sorts of immunosuppressive treatments. And he was persistently RNA positive out past day 150. And you can see that here we go down through time from day 18 to day 152, and you see that N501 Y came up and fixed at about day 128, and E484K came and went. And so the idea is thought that maybe with extended replication in the presence of low or absent, most likely low neutralizing antibodies, you get selection for these. This is the next strain page, which is really worth visiting. And this looks complicated, but basically these are just each individual sequences starting back in China. And then over time, the number of mutations occurring, and the B117 and B1351 are in red and orange. And you can see that the number of mutations in those tend to be higher, or became higher. If we pull those out and look at them, you can see that the estimated substitution rate is about 31 as opposed to 23 for previous strains. And so that doesn't mean, I want to hasten that, it doesn't mean that B117 or 135 or any of them are now mutating faster. The viruses, each of them is probably still doing this, but the record, perhaps extended replication, stochastic burst of replication in immunocompromised people, left them by December with a record of that, but they're probably still doing this. The intrinsic mutability hasn't changed, as far as we know. And this just shows you how this can go under the radar, and you may think nothing's happening. If you look at France from August to now, the total number of cases has really been about the same, but what's happening under the radar is that the not variant strains are going down and being replaced by variant strains, mostly B117, but a few others. And so the total stays the same, but this is coming up. And another way to look at it, if you look at the UK epidemic with good lockdowns and everything, they're declining like we are overall. But it's remarkably lineage specific. If you look at total cases, or non-B117 cases, they're really falling steeply, but total cases are falling much less quickly on a log scale. And so that's B117 there. All right, let's talk about this virus, this variant in the US and Colorado. Let's see, it's 26. Yeah, I'm okay, I'm on time. This variant of concern is now spreading rapidly, exponentially in the United States as our overall cases fall. This is a nice graphic actually put together by the New York Times on March 6th. And it just shows that this is an exponential curve. It's curving upwards. B117 variant's estimated share of US cases has grown exponentially. This is it on the full scale. That put down here, at least 20% B117 now, doubling time about 10 days. Mike Osterholm, epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota, thinks we're in the eye of the hurricane where everything sort of looks calm, but the hurricane's about to come over us unless we're careful. And what's going on in Colorado? Well, as of yesterday, there were 190 known B117 cases so far, estimated percentage by the CDPHE of 3 to 6%, rough estimate. There's also the California variant, or B1427/B1429, 88 cases so far. And on just March 5th, 3 cases of the South African variant, 351, was detected in 2 guards and 1 prisoner in a prison near Colorado Springs. I don't have any other epidemiological information on whether they had traveled outside the state. But that's here too. But okay, so yeah, 190 and 3 to 6%, but as my very good colleagues who are doing this at the CDPHE will tell you, we're sort of flying blind. Our US surveillance sequencing is really poor. Less than 1% of cases, so you can easily miss things. UK is doing about 10%, where you're unlikely to miss things. And it varies much by state. And the sad thing about this graph is that this is the amount of sequencing on the y-axis, and then the number of cumulative cases on the x-axis. And so the states that have the most cases are doing the least sequencing, and the states that have the least cases, like Hawaii, are doing the most sequencing. And that's, this line is going this way. It ought to be going this way. Colorado's down here. So, you know, we're in the middle in terms of number of cases, middle to lower. This is a log scale, but we're on the lower end of sequencing too. Someone said this, I remembered it, I can't remember who said it. Somebody knowledgeable said this, so I can't attribute it, but I'll just say it. In the US, we're not just sequencing the tip of the iceberg, we're sequencing a little ice cube on top of the tip of the iceberg. That about sums it up. I look at Florida. Striking rise in Florida as of March 7th. 40% of all positives are S gene target failures. Presumptive B117. If you look at the non-S gene target failures, they're going down. The S gene target failures, they're going up. Now, important point is, all is not lost. This variant, just like any of the others, there's nothing magic about it. It can still be well controlled by non-pharmaceutical interventions. Okay, masks and distancing. Everything we know about so well now that we didn't know March 10th a year ago. Look what happened to Ireland. B117 just went vertical, just took off like crazy. 8% on December 20th, 50% on B1 on January 12th. I think it's like 95% now. Exponential rise, right associated with Christmas, and they did a hard lockdown, and it fell just as exponentially. This is a picture I took in 2019 on a family vacation. This country near and dear to my heart, half Irish, and this is when Americans could still travel. And so, without getting too mathematical, R0 or R0 that you've heard about is the basic reproduction number, or average number of secondary infections an average person generates. It's not a fixed property. The value at a given time or RT depends on 4 components: duration, transmissibility, duration of infectiousness, transmissibility, opportunities for transmission, and susceptibility. 2 of these are under our control, behavior and vaccines. 2 are not, duration of infectiousness and transmissibility. That's an intrinsic viral property. But we can control these, and we know how with these 2 variables. Okay. So B1.351. This is also called 501YV2. And here's where the issue of immune evasion really comes up. It didn't really come up for B117. It just seemed to be more transmissible. This is the South African variant. By the way, South African variants were the first to actually identify 501Y as well and communicate it to English colleagues. And they really have been pretty dynamic. And this was first detected by them on December 18th. And like in the UK, the sequencing was prompted by cases inexplicably rising in the Eastern Cape province when good restriction measures were in place. It's more transmissible probably. It rapidly displaced other lineages in South Africa like B117 did in the UK. It's also in some US states now, as I just said. It has N501Y, but it also has these 2, E484K and K417N in the receptor binding domain. And this is more concerning. These 2 both seem to increase affinity, but K484 can diminish neutralizing antibody binding too. And an overarching concept is that reinfection is likely happening either during the initial selection events or now. With this variant, it may not be that it was in individual immunocompromised people, but a more broad population selection. This is data from South Africa from the lab of Penny Moore, who's chair of virus host dynamics at University of Witwatersrand. And it shows reduced neutralization of this variant in COVID patient sera. So this is neutralization titer, and this is the wild type, the D614G, and you see on average it falls with the virus engineered to just have those 3 mutations, and then the actual virus itself, substantial or complete escape from neutralizing antibodies in COVID convalescent plasma, complete escape from 3 classes of monoclonals. I'm not showing that here. Bunch of papers on this now. There's another one from South Africa, and a bunch of papers popping up everywhere. This is a good paper. Other evidence, the Novavax phase 2b study is really a fascinating study. This is not an mRNA vaccine. This is a spike protein nanoparticle. It doesn't de novo synthesize spike, but it delivers preformed spike. And they were doing phase 2b, and they found, in addition to the vaccine efficacy, which worked, that prior SARS-CoV-2 infection did not protect against B1351. This is important because it's real people data, not in vitro sera data like I've been showing you. The placebo group came in and having had prior infection did not protect them. However, the vaccine was efficacious, and as a theme, the vaccines are likely to still work even for this one, preventing COVID-19. So the take-home points are, though, that the level from this and other studies, the levels of immunity from natural infection, degree intensity of breath is not enough to protect against this variant. You see reinfection, and vaccines work better than natural infection for a whole bunch of reasons, including boosting. We need to complete full vaccination. It's the only safe way to achieve herd immunity. I don't talk about T-cell immunity, and there's much less on this, but that whole arm of the immune system is also going on, and it's just harder to measure, and it's not been measured much. The focus has been on antibodies and B cells. But there are papers, preprints at least, showing negligible impact of these variants on cell-mediated immunity. So that's another sort of arrow in the quiver. Here's actual testing against the Moderna vaccine. This was a preprint for a long time. It just came out in the New England Journal. There's a real paper this week, I think yesterday. And there's this is the thing to focus on, there's a 6.4-fold drop from the parental wild type strain to when you look at phase 1 human sera against B1351. These are 2-dose vaccinated people, but the neutralizing titers are still good. They're still greater than 100. And so it's not that worse if you're starting out above 1,000. And if you fall to that, you still should have protection. So the take home is that the mRNA vaccine titers fall somewhat for this, but the vaccine should still work. Looking at the same thing for Pfizer BNT, this just came out this week too, all hot off the press. This is the mRNA vaccine that a lot of us got. And it induced neutralizing titers against all 3 variants. It worked against all 3. All serum samples effectively neutralized them, all with mean geometric titers greater than about 80. Some drop off, especially with the South African variant, a little drop off with P1. But that mRNA vaccine, very good vaccine, and it still should. This does not show. There's not people failing or not failing exposure. This is testing the sera from initial vaccines. All right. Let's see. It's 12:42. Okay, I'm pretty much on time. Let's talk about P1 and what I would say is the agony of Brazil. This started here in Manaus, deep in the Amazon River basin, in Amazonas province, state, I mean. There are 26 states in Brazil. Similar mutation as B1351. Those 3 mutations, except that the lysine went to a threonine instead of an asparagine at 417. It rose independently in Amazonia. It spread rapidly in the setting of significant pre-existing immunity in Manaus. And like 351 and 117, B117, it's probably more transmissible. And this is the daily new deaths in Brazil. It's just climbing relentlessly. This is just a few days ago here. Shortages of oxygen, families trying to find oxygen tanks, heartbreaking stories of doctors just having oxygen run out and just having to give the patients morphine and let them die. Mass burials. This is data from Brazil, preprint, showing that reinfection is likely happening. The blue here represents virus replicating. This parental B strain was inhibited at about a dilution of 1:60, but by convalescent plasma, but the P1 strain really wasn't inhibited. This is convalescent plasma from 19 Brazilian patients who were infected back in May. There's about 6-fold less neutralizing capacity against P1 than the wild type B lineage. And that squares with this more developed study from David Ho's lab at Columbia, March 2 preprint, also very new. And they tested a SARS-CoV-2 VS3G pseudovirus with all 10 mutations that are found in spike in P1. They called it BZ Delta 10. They tested 18 neutralizing monoclonals, 20 convalescent plasma, 22 vaccine sera. There's a clear problem with particular monoclonals. These are the EUA approved ones that you know about, Regeneron. This is the Lilly, one of the Lilly ones. And what you see here is an either or effect, as you'd expect. These monoclonals bind one epitope. And the ones that bind at E40, one single place on the protein, they either work or they don't. They work or they don't. They work or they don't. It's like either or, which is what you think would happen. Whereas the polyclonal antibody, many antibodies binding by an mRNA, produced by an mRNA vaccine of convalescent plasma, here's convalescent plasma, there's more gradient of activity, but there's still a fall. It's not that great. Consistent with that Brazil study, 6.5-fold for convalescent plasma, same result really. And then for the 2 vaccine sera, multiple patients, about 2 to 3-fold. So this is in vitro data, again, does not show any clinical vaccine failure, and the vaccine should work. If you and I have a titer from either one of these that falls about 3-fold, we're still way up here. There's no reason to think the vaccine shouldn't protect against this. Just want to emphasize this a little bit because this is really amazing. in the Amazon. It's a real recipe for disaster, not only for Brazil, but for everyone around the world. 220 million people in Brazil, 26 states, vast territories, vast income inequality, people all over are dying at home. Only the US has had more deaths. ICUs are overwhelmed, oxygen shortages, ventilator shortages, cemeteries running out of space. I saw talk of vertical burials to save space the other day. Bolsonaro is really terrible. He's an anti-science populist and COVID denialist. That may sound familiar to the American audience. Vaccination's critical, but way behind. There's shortages, bureaucracy, little coordination. Each state is on its own, kind of like the US too. And it's a concern for the world as well as Brazil, because what you have is continuous abundant SARS-CoV-2 replication and further variant selection, potentially in large, partially immune populations. That's the danger. If you're fully immune or not immune, not a lot of selection going on. If you're partially immune, selection. Okay. So a 10-point summary of likely impacts of variants on vaccines and treatments. The vaccines should still robustly protect this year, likely next year. Boosting may be needed in the future when is not worked out. Vaccines are better than natural immunity. There's every reason to suspect that now. And we really have to vaccinate the world, not just rich countries. We're going to lose the game if we just vaccinate rich countries. Vaccines will definitely protect against B117 with the same efficacy shown from trials before it arose. It should still work for the Brazil and South African variants. But we are probably going to need to update those vaccines in the future. That's going to be easier with the mRNA ones, less so with the adenoviral vector ones like the AstraZeneca, Oxford, or the J&J one, because you got immunity to the actual adenovirus too. And so you have to change that out too, which isn't so easy. So you don't want to block the vector. You do want to get antibodies to the spike protein. T cells are also going on, not measured in most analyses. Cell-mediated immunity. Specific monoclonals are affected, but combinations can work. Some individual ones that are E484 binders won't, probably. Convalescent plasma less affected, but that's really going to be less important going forward anyway as a treatment. And the virus could have further surprises for us. Just very briefly, it's 12:48. New York and California variants of interest. I'm not calling these variants of concern, but variants of interest. The New York variant, B1526, was reported in late February from two groups, one at Caltech, the Bjorkman lab, and then one by David Ho's lab in New York. These are preprints, not peer-reviewed, does have E484K. Accounts for about 25% of sequences deposited from New York during February in 2021. Impact still not clear. The California variant, B1427, or separate sublineage 429, this is rather different. It lacks, this is the table, okay? So Brazil and South Africa have each of these three mutations. B117 UK, just 501Y up in that spike receptor binding domain. The California variant has an L452 arginine mutation, and not these three. There's no preprint even on this. There's been press conference claims for higher transmissibility and severity, but you can't hang your hat on this. The one reason to be interested in is that it hasn't been detected by CDPHE in Colorado, 88 cases as of March 9th, and all are, I think I don't know which 120C is, it's one of these two numbers. So that's something to keep an eye on, but it's really not clear what's going on. It also has an effect of escaping from at least one monoclonal bamlanivimab. This is the Lilly cocktail, bamlanivimab and etesevimab, also known as these, and you can see that they're not going to work for B1351 and P1. They're okay for B117, some impact on the California variant. All right, so here are my overall conclusions. The virus is replicating in global populations at high levels. New variants were detected in late 2020 and spread rapidly. B.1.1.7 is more transmissible and is increasing in the US. B.1.351 and P1 display immune escape features. They're more transmissible too. Immune selection of the kind that produced them may increase now. Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, about 3 to 7-fold reductions in neutralizing antibody titer, likely not a big problem, not certain. And these are the numbers. They've come to Colorado, 193 and 88. The vaccines will still work and are likely to work better than natural immunity. It's critical to complete our vaccine rollout soon, and we really need to commit to vaccinating the world or everyone will lose. Updating of the sequences in the mRNA vaccines are likely to be needed at some point. When and how is not clear. And then if we have time, after in the question session, we can get into this. Will this virus become endemic? It kind of depends what you mean. Uncertain, probably yes. But endemicity is kind of a fuzzy word. And then what are the limits? How far can this go? Likely a lot. We could discuss that if we have time. And then this virus and future new emerging viruses are going to continue to surprise us. So I'll just pull that back there, and everyone's still there.
Eric, everyone's still here and trained in what you've presented. It's thank you so much for educating us. We have a lot of questions about this, and there's a tremendous amount of interest. Just first of all, put this in context for us a little bit. This virus, SARS-CoV-2, is mutating. Is it mutating faster than other RNA viruses like HIV? What's the mutation rate, and is this unusual?
It's actually mutating slower than HIV. HIV is extraordinarily prolific at mutation. And so the virus in any one patient at any one time is fully resistant to the contemporaneous antibodies present in that patient. If you happen to bank virus from a year ago, you'll find that the antibodies the patient has now will block it, but it doesn't block the virus they have now. And coronaviruses are actually relatively low mutators. They have to be because they have the largest RNA genome, they're 30 kilobases, that's as big as it gets. And they actually have a proofreading ability, which is essentially unique among RNA viruses. And so they mutate less. So no, it's not increasing its mutation rate, but there's still ample, it's an RNA virus, and it can mutate a lot. And that's a given, that's axiomatic, that's not new.
So you indicated that the current vaccines are likely effective against the variants. Are there any cases that have been reported in individuals that have either had previous infections or have been vaccinated that have developed secondary infections with the variants?
Yes, so there are definitely individual case reports both in South Africa and in Brazil. In that Novavax trial, when they looked at the placebo group, they found that having had prior parental non-variant COVID didn't protect. So yeah, reinfection is clearly, it's incontrovertible, reinfection is happening. But that's not mRNA vaccinated people. Those are people who had prior natural infection.
Right. Yep. And importantly, you indicated that the vaccines are more effective at producing an immune response to the virus than a previous infection is.
Yeah, and then that Novavax trial is a good indication. The vaccine, that's a good vaccine, by the way. I think it was up around 90% trial efficacy. It worked. Mm-hmm. It's just that the placebo group, whether they'd had past COVID, didn't protect them.
So you focused on the mutations in in the spike protein for good reason, but you also indicated that there are mutations in other viral proteins. How does that affect stability and replication rate of the virus? Are those selective mutations as well?
Most probably, yes. And there hasn't been as much focus on that, but a number of the other proteins have immune evasion functions. And they interfere with various defense proteins, restriction factors, and so forth. And there appear to be changes in some of those. There are changes in the polymerase. So those are probably important too. People haven't had time. There's been so much focus on, really the main thing is the external part of the virus that's really engaging antibodies, the spike protein. But they are almost certainly being selected too for function. Some of them are probably founder effects too. It's really not worked out. But yes, there's certainly selection going on there too.
And what about the effect of these variants on T cell immunity as opposed to antibody engagement?
So far when it's been looked at, as you'd sort of expect, the main driver, the main thing are these spike changes. That there really doesn't seem to be an effect on T cell immunity that's major. No one's picked that up. There are certain T cell epitopes that, peptides in MHC class 1 will probably be selected just as they are for HIV for evasion, but that's not panned out yet as a significant contributor. People really think the most important thing going on now is antibody evasion of the spike protein in the receptor binding domain, and to some extent in the N-terminal domain as well.
So here's a vaccination question. We're telling our patients that the best vaccine is the vaccine that you can get. And yet evidence is that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines may be more effective than the J&J vaccine. Can you comment on that and how you would counsel your patients?
So I agree with the take the vaccine you can get, and the J&J vaccine is a good vaccine. It's marginally less effective, and that's been the case for all of the adenovirus vector vaccines. And so, yeah, in trial efficacy, I have to be honest, the Pfizer, BNT, and Moderna are better, but the others are still remarkable. If we had we're sort of spoiled by the mRNA vaccines being so spectacular that it's not a time to turn up our noses. So yeah, I would readily get the J&J vaccine. And it's really, the key thing is if we all get that, we protect each other. So it's not just about, the key thing is getting to 70-80% vaccination levels, and then none of us have to worry if we get to that saturation level. That's what's really critical. And so I would absolutely I would, if I hadn't been first in line because I'm a clinician and gotten the mRNA ones, I would definitely happily, and I wouldn't scheme to go and get the mRNA one instead. I'd just go and get the J&J one. So get the J&J one.
So let's end with a population-based question. Tell us what you would predict is going to happen with these variants as the warmer weather comes, as restrictions diminish with spring break and other activities, and how careful do we need to continue to be?
Well, we that's the key thing. We really need to double down now. This is what we're dealing with. And so, yeah, spring break coming up, Florida.
Colorado skiing. Yeah.
So, all of these things. So I think it's really important that we double down and not be short-sighted. I can't predict the future. If we're lucky, this vaccination wave is going to take care of it. Coloradans seem to be all along sort of better behaved. Um, and so I think what's also going on is people are saying, you know, they see light at the end of the tunnel. They know they're going to get a vaccine soon. They're not willing to risk it at this point. So I think that's also going psychologically. I don't know if data for that, but when I go out and walk around, people masked up everywhere, and so I'm actually optimistic. I think we're going to squeak by, but you never know. So I like that Ireland slide. Those things can control it. So the key thing is, what you don't want is uncontrolled replication. You know, and I guess that also brings up the final question is, beyond this, what are the limits to this? Are we going to see 10 more variants? And that's a complicated question. A lot of people, or some people would say this, look, E484K, this main antibody evasion mutant, it's come up all over the world independently, conversion evolution. And so the fact that they've all hit on the same solution suggests that we've already seen the limit of what the virus can do, that the future chess moves are limited, that so-called peak fitness has been reached. And that was actually broached in a New Yorker article that I urge people to read this week about the variant. But there's a lot of pushback on that article already on message boards and things from evolutionary virologists, of which I'm not. But the top evolutionary virologists in the field really think that the power of selection to explore high dimensional sequence space, and that space changes over time, is enormous, and more likely the chessboard resets. It's not checkmated. Transmission efficiency may hit a biological wall. It's likely going to happen, but and again, look at measles. That's much more transmissible than this virus, and there's good precedent for a much higher R0 respiratory virus. The virus likely won't run out of evolutionary space for antigenic change. At least I think that's my view, and I think that's shared by a lot of people. Also consider that this virus can infect a lot of different mammals. So it's tolerant to mutations. It's good at shape-shifting envelopes. You can adapt it to mice fairly quickly. So, and I mean, one of the metaphors or analogies people use is the 4 seasonal coronaviruses, which you all get as kids. Everybody on this call right now has immunity to all 4 of them, almost universal, because we get them as kids, we're re-exposed as young adults, and then immunity starts to fade, we get re-exposed, and people say, well, it's going to just be like that next year. The problem with that is those things settled into endemicity, likely a century ago to many centuries ago. And so we don't really know what happened. We don't know how long that took. It may have been 10 years for some of these to settle down and be less pathogenic. But we don't really know that it's going to, it's really, you can't predict. I just don't think you can predict that what's going to happen, and that we're going to suddenly have a situation in 2 years where this is just like one of those 4 viruses. It's also a different virus. You know, this virus has different biological properties. It makes people really sick. It seems to infect more organs than they do. And so I think we just don't know. But I really don't think that, to go back to where I started, I don't think that the virus has now hit peak fitness and it's not going to do other things. I think that we're in for some more surprises.
Well, I think that's a good point for us to end the discussion. Eric, this has been incredibly informative at just the right time. So thank you very much. It's great to have you on our faculty, given your expertise, especially at this point in time. So if you have other questions, feel comfortable about emailing me or emailing Eric, and we'll get those questions answered for you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.